Welcome to my world history course. Today we are going to have our first lecture. It's exploration and European expansion overseas. As I said to you last time, our course throughout this semester will be exploration of how our world became modern. That's what happened after the 1500s. So we're going to examine how so-called modern life was spearheaded and how different countries, civilizations, and cultures had to adjust themselves to so-called modern life, to its challenges, contradictions. Today we're going to discuss what I mentioned last time. When I explained to you last time what we were going to do, I stressed that the reason we divide world history in two parts, before the 1500s and after the 1500s, was that before the 1500s, roughly before the 1500s, our world was pre-modern. And after the 1500s, it's a history of the modern world and post-modern in our days. Okay. What made the world modern, one of the reasons what made our world modern is that we are not isolated from each other. At least 90% of people are not isolated anymore. But it hadn't been the case before the 1500s, when the whole world was in a total isolation from each other. Different corners of our globe were not aware of each other. And the first thing, there was no awareness on the part of those people who lived in the old, so-called old world, of those people and cultures who lived in the new world, and vice versa. There was no knowledge among Native Americans who lived in the Western Hemisphere of the people who lived in so-called old world. This was over. This was over in the 1500s, okay? And eventually, throughout explorations and intercultural communications, our world became like a big global village where, for better or for worse, people started to trade, fight each other, establishing relationships with each other, intermarrying each other. And as I said last time, we can identify a few spearheads at that time, the 1500s, a few spearheads. What happened by chance in world history at that time? What contributed to the rise of the modern world? Again, nobody mean it. It happened by chance. Everything what happens in our history is unpredictable. History does not develop in a progressive way, you know. History, it's something that you cannot predict. It can go up, it can go down. Sometimes we think that something good happens and it turns out to be bad, or something bad happens and out of this badness, so to speak, good things come about. Or most frequently, there are different things come out from one event, one big event, good and bad things, unpredictable things. Something happens in world history which people who live or lived at that time or who live right now, they are not aware that this particular event might become a big deal historically. This event could be celebrated or cursed by the descendants as some kind of great or horrible event. Okay. There are certain events that hardly arouse any interest, or nobody notes them, nobody notices them. Or on the other hand, there are some minor accidental events that trigger a chain of fortunate or unfortunate events. It depends how things turn out, or it depends from what viewpoint you look at things. Okay. By the way, each event in the world history frequently is assessed by us, people who belong to different classes, different ethnic, racial groups, different countries, different cultures. So we view the world differently. There is no one unified view of the world, okay? And that's what I am also going to do in my course. I will try to sample different viewpoints, okay? Of course, like any other instructor, professor, I have my biases probably, and the most important thing is to be aware of your biases and to articulate them and to encourage people who see them to criticize them. That is why I always tell my students, whatever you hear from me, from other instructors, you take it, learn it, take your exams, pass your exams, but in the long run, look at things critically. Use your critical mind, use your critical thinking when you approach information you receive from all media sources, from us, educators, from books you read. Compare, contrast, and always exercise your critical faculties. So one of the big events that contributed to the rise of the modern world was so-called geographical explorations. Something that was launched by people who lived in Western Europe. Europe was a backyard of the world, undeveloped backyard of the world, until roughly the 1400s. Or many pockets of Europe were still undeveloped as late as the 1600s. But something happened in Western Europe. Again, nobody was aware of this. It happened by chance. Something happened in Western Europe which triggered the chain of these events that became known as geographical discoveries, explorations, colonization. Western Europeans sailed overseas, and something triggered them to sail overseas, and we're going to explore this. As I said, Europe was a backyard at first. Europe was a backyard of the world in pre-modern age. Chinese civilization, Indian civilization were shining, but as frequently happens in world history, some civilizations go up, some civilizations go down, and everything is unpredictable. And that's what happened in the 1500s. Suddenly Europe started to go forward. Suddenly Europe started to shine. And we are going to explore what made Europe shine compared to other parts of the world. And first of all, when I say shining, I mean the technological, economic advances, okay, which gave Europeans the power to expand and eventually to colonize different parts of the world, okay. First, we have in Europe tools been invented, tools of technological advance that eventually were used by Europeans for expansion overseas. By the 1500s, Europeans had magnetic compass, which in fact was introduced by the Arabs, but Europeans took it and perfected it. They had navigational charts, they had precise maps, they had new boats that were navigated by sails. When you position sails in a certain way to harness the energy of the winds. So by doing this, Europeans could unleash this power of the wind to build ocean-going boats. They also started to manufacture guns and cannons. And as I said, things happened by chance. It's not because in Europe, in Western Europe, there were some special people, special people who were smart. No. Something happened that encouraged them to use the noodles to introduce things, to invent things. Okay. For example, those of you who took world history first part, you probably heard about the epidemic of plague, so-called Black Death. It's a bubonic epidemic of bubonic plague that took place and had taken place in Europe in the 1300s, when in parts of Europe up to 60% of people died. People died like flies. So many lords and aristocrats, or kings in Europe, they didn't have enough manpower. They didn't have enough peasants to work for them. They didn't have enough soldiers to fight for them. So that's one of the reasons why Europeans eventually started to expand the power of the windmills or water mills, or which had been introduced by the way very early, but what I just mentioned, epidemic of bubonic plague, encouraged this switch to some extra devices that could supplement or replace the human power, because manpower was missing. Or when European kings or lords, as I said, they needed soldiers. How could they get soldiers when a lot of people died? So they started to gradually introduce guns and cannons, because by having guns and cannons, whose killing power is very deadly, as you know, you could you didn't need so many archers or spear throwers. Okay, by having a cannon and a gun, or a person who handled a musket, you could replace like 10 archers. Okay, that's what some historians call European miracle. Again, I put this expression in quotation marks, because by saying miracle, we just mention something that happened by chance, that triggered Europeans to come up with all these inventions, which, for instance, people in my former home country, Russia, were not incentivized to come up. Okay. Chinese were not incentivized. Okay. So we're talking about what triggered Europeans to expand overseas. Okay. Another thing, Europe had a nice geographical environment. So if you look at the map of Europe, again, look at the map of Europe, again, you hardly can see it here. It's like Europe is like a peanut. But again, imagine Europe, the map of Europe, you will see that Europe was right in the getting into the Atlantic Ocean, facing the Atlantic Ocean. So Atlantic Ocean and these warm seas were all around the water coasts of Europe. So Europe was nicely located to do this ocean navigation, unlike, for instance, landlocked civilizations like this Russia I already named. Russia was landlocked, or northern India, or Mongols, or other civilizations who had no access to the sea. Okay. Unlike many other parts of the world, Europe was also decentralized. Okay. What does it mean? It means there was no strong power on top of people. Okay. If you look at the map of Europe again, in 1300s, 1400s, you will see a bunch of small kingdoms, principalities, lordships, whatever, independent towns, and they were trading with each other, they were fighting each other. Okay, a lot of was going on. But this decentralization encouraged this sense of independence when you were not dominated by one king. So peasants in late Middle Ages in Europe, they were not serfs anymore because of this decentralization. Peasants frequently escaped from their lords. Okay. Unlike other parts of the world where people were either peasants or slaves, they couldn't even leave their places. They had to work for the kings or lords. But in Europe, it wasn't the case of Europe, where, I repeat, there was a lot of opportunities for peasants either to escape from their lords or to just blackmail their lords, because in the wake of this bubonic epidemic of bubonic plague, there was so little manpower that lords had to beg peasants, come with us, work for us, and the cost of peasant labor increased. Okay, so it kind of encouraged this personal independence, ingenuity. Okay. Now we're going to discuss what motivated Europeans to expand. Okay. In fact, some of the European kingdoms, like Portugal, for instance, they actually had experience of going to the open sea as early as the 1300s. Okay, because some of them were interested in looking for like lost Christian kingdom or Prester John. Okay, it happened in the early Middle Ages. This traditional Prester John went back to early Middle Ages, when Muslim civilization aggressively moved in the Middle East and dislodged Christians from Palestine, from Egypt, from Northern Africa. As you know, in early Middle Ages, these areas, Middle East, Northern Africa, these were areas occupied by Christian civilization, but in 1600s, 1700s, they were invaded and occupied by the Muslims. Okay, and there were legends that some King Prester John escaped somewhere to the mountains, and there's a Christian kingdom that was hiding somewhere in the mountains. So there was this bizarre notion among Europeans who lived in coastal areas to find this kingdom that was lost, unconquered by the Muslims. But again, that's not the major thing. That was just on the surface. The major thing was this, what you can see on this slide. Okay, Europeans were involved in the trade with Asia. Okay, but then trade was disrupted. More and more was disrupted by these Muslim invasions, and eventually in the 1300s, when so-called Ottoman Turks who positioned themselves as the shield of the Muslim civilization, they literally closed the Middle East for the European trade. Or at least it wasn't so easy for the Europeans to trade with India, Malaysia, China, to trade for what? For spices. And the Muslim merchants actually hijacked these trade routes, and they started to charge this huge fees on spices. But spices were very valuable at that time in Europe. What made them special? Spices were, of course, they could be used to preserve the food, to spice the food, because food is always tastes better when it's with spices. 95% of people in Europe in 1500s, they actually never sing spices. In Europe, food was flat, untasty to our taste, present day taste. It was only aristocrats who could use spices. In fact, having ginger, cinnamon, or pepper on your table, it was a sign of you being a rich person, an aristocrat. It's like in our days, they're driving Ferrari or some red car. Imagine they're driving a red car. So it was a status symbol to have spices on your table. Okay, so Europeans wanted to trade freely with Eastern countries. Okay, so that what was motivated them to go overseas. They wanted to find sea routes to bypass Muslim middlemen. Okay, there was a second reason. For now, we are not going to discuss it too much, the second reason, but for the time being, I just want to mention that next week or week after, we're going to discuss so-called Protestant Reformation. So there was a religious war in Europe between two groups of Christians, Catholics and Protestants. There was a split within a Roman Catholic Church, split into Protestants and Catholics. Two groups of Christians started to fight each other, and eventually northern part of Europe was lost for the Catholic Church. Okay, so Roman popes lost northern part of Europe, which followed Martin Luther, and They became Protestants. So trying to alleviate the situation, Catholic Church decided to send a lot of missionaries overseas to convert new people. Okay, so that was another reason why some European countries wanted to expand. Okay, but the major one is right here. You can see it on my slide. It is colored in red color. Okay, the hunt for spices. So we need to go overseas to find new trade routes to establish this free trade without any Muslim middleman. Okay, that was the goal. As I said, some pockets of Europe, they had this tradition of seagoing practices. For example, Portugal. Portugal, by the way, the country that is located right on the coast of Atlantic Ocean. Look at this nickname of one of the princes of Portugal, Henry, who ruled Portugal in at the turn of the 1400s until 1460. This prince received the nickname Henry the Navigator. The Navigator, that was nickname. So he set up a school for navigators just to purposely organize seagoing expeditions to find these new trade routes to the east. Okay, and what they did, Portuguese, they kept sailing along the Western African coast. Okay, Western African coast. Look at this map. Okay, look at this map. See the cursor. So that's what the Portugal. See the Portugal. So that's how they were sailing along the African coast, and they had many expeditions going southward to find the new trade routes, and many of them were not successful. Okay, in fact, one of the navigators called Bartholomew Dias, he actually was able to reach the southernmost part of Africa. Okay, right here, the Cape of Good Hope. But he ran out of food and fresh water, so he had to go back, and his sailors revolted against him and told him, let's go back, we don't have enough food. Okay, but his successor, named Vasco da Gama, was able to make it. And by the way, that's what they were doing, the Portuguese. They established a set of supply stations along the Western African coast. They concluded agreements with local African kings to provide them fresh water and food. Okay, by using these supply stations, eventually they made it to India. So Vasco da Gama, see, this name is colored in red. You have to remember this name. You will see this name on your quizzes, on your exams. Okay. So finally, the Portuguese sailed, kept sailing, and Vasco da Gama eventually reached India. So he was able to squeeze out the Muslim merchants. He purchased spices, ginger, pepper, cinnamon directly from Indians, came back and became a very wealthy man. Very wealthy man. Okay. As I said, Portuguese squeezed out Muslim merchants from the Indian trade, and eventually Portuguese came to control these trade routes. Okay, they started to call shots here. The entire Indian Ocean trade was controlled by the Portuguese. They were actually armed clashes with Muslims, and Portuguese defeated the Muslim merchants because they had guns, muskets. They had the maneuverable boats, so they were better technologically equipped than their competitors, Muslim merchants. Okay, they set up colonies here, small trade towns, colonizing the Indian coast. The neighbors of Portuguese were Spaniards. Okay, as you know, Spain. You heard about country Spain. It's another westernmost country of Europe. Spain speaks a similar language with Portuguese. In fact, they belong to the same culture. It's called Iberian culture. Basically, it's a people of the same stock. Okay, they speak different dialects. So Spain became jealous of Portuguese because Portuguese were controlling this Indian trade, and we want the same piece of pie. How do we get this? Okay. And that's when famous man Christopher Columbus comes to the picture. Okay. You heard about Christopher Columbus, right? Christopher Columbus. I don't have his picture here, but again, you can Google it, you can see it. Christopher Columbus, at first, he actually approached the Portuguese and he said, yes, I know you have trade routes to India, but it's a long way. Okay, I'm offering you a shortcut. Okay, I'm going to offer you, let's go to the west, since there is nothing here. Again, nobody knew that there was North and South America here. People were not aware of this, but people did know that the globe was round. Okay. Again, only ignorant peasants believed that the world was flat, but most educated people, they knew that the world was round. And Christopher Columbus said to Portuguese prince, I forgot who was at that time in power, but anyway, he said to the Portuguese prince that I can find a shortcut, you can save time and money, and we will go directly to the west and we will hit China, India, Indonesia, and here you go. You don't need to do this long route through the southernmost part of Africa, Indian Ocean, a lot of hazards here. So let's go straight to the west. Okay. But the Portuguese already said, no, we don't need it. We are not interested. We are fine with this because it's already, yes, it's a long route, but it's an established route. Okay, we have everything under control. And so he goes to Spanish king and queen. At that time, by the way, the year is, probably 1492. So he approaches Spanish queen and king. They got married. Spain was divided before 1492. In fact, 1492, Spanish people completed unification of the country, and the two Spanish kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, they got together because their king and queen, they married each other. Okay, so Columbus approached them with the same project. I'm going to the west to find a shortcut. Are you interested? Because Portuguese control the seas, and I'm offering you a good project. Who was Christopher Columbus? Christopher Columbus was a Jewish Italian from a city of Genoa. Genoa, it's an Italian city with a rich tradition of Mediterranean trade. So people who lived in Genoa, they were born merchants. Okay, the entire life of the city was was revolving around trade. So they were trading with Muslims, with other Europeans. In fact, Genoans, people who lived in Genoa, they acted as middlemen. So Columbus was born in this culture. So he was exposed to culture, navigation, maps, compasses, everything. Okay. So he approaches the Spanish king and queen, and they said, yes, we're going to do it. So they gave him permission, money, and commissioned him to go overseas. Okay. And that's how everything started. Remember this. The year 1492, he went to the ocean blue. 1492, ocean blue. Columbus goes to the west, and suddenly he stumbles upon lands, unfamiliar lands. In fact, the first areas he discovered or opened up or invaded, it depends how you want to define it, was Cuba and so-called Hispaniola. Hispaniola, it's a name they used at that time to refer to Haiti. You heard about country Haiti right now, so that's what he reached. Dominican Republic and Haiti, it's island of Haiti. Okay, now it accommodates two countries. At that time, so he labeled it Hispaniola. So I might ask you on a quiz this question. So what were the first two areas of the Western Hemisphere which Columbus reached? Okay, so that's the answer. You know the answer. So he reaches Cuba and Hispaniola, Haiti, and he sees the people. dark-skinned people with this, but they didn't have any pepper and cinnamon, any spices. Okay. But he believed, Columbus still believed it was India. He sincerely believed he discovered parts of India. And that is why he labeled these people Indians. Remember, that's the old name for American Indians. Of course, now, you know, those people who had been labeled Indians, now they prefer to be called Native Americans, as you know. American Indians, the word of choice is Native American or indigenous people. That's how they call themselves now. But again, Columbus had labeled them Indians, and for a long time, this expression Indians was used until 1970s, 1980s. That was the expression used. So he opened up these areas, and in fact, Columbus was not exactly a successful person. He did opened up these lands for Spanish queen and king. They were happy, but he hardly benefited from this. Okay, he was I wouldn't call him a colonizer. Okay, so he did not enslave, he didn't own any plantations, so he personally did not own any slaves, did not put Indians in chains. You know, he actually was an explorer in this case, and that's I wanted to emphasize this, because frequently Columbus is labeled as a bloody, brutal colonizer. Okay. But the people who followed him were brutal colonizers who took advantage of this and who capitalized on his so-called discoveries. Okay. And what he did see in the hands of Native Americans whom he met in Cuba, Hispaniola, he saw that instead of pepper, ginger, and cinnamon, they had gold. And when Columbus and his successors who followed his footsteps, they asked American Indians, so where you got the stuff? So they pointed American Indians, to the west, by saying that, oh, there was a rich kingdom in the west, they had more gold. Okay, and that's what motivated these Europeans, Spaniards, who eventually came to these areas and colonized these areas. Again, now you can see this big map, see Cuba and Hispaniola, so populated by Indians. Now, by the way, you cannot see a single Indian here, because Indians eventually died from European diseases. We're going to mention this briefly in a few minutes. Okay. But American Indians whom Spaniards met pointed somewhere to the west, by saying to Europeans that there is a big, powerful kingdom over there, so they have more gold. And that's what motivated Europeans. Okay, so we have a few other people who followed in the footsteps of Columbus, and the first one was Hernando Cortez. And by the way, these people who followed Columbus, who wanted to conquer the American Indians, who wanted to subjugate them, to find the gold and subjugate these indigenous people, they called themselves conquistadors, so which means in translation from Spanish conquerors. Conquistadors, that's how they call themselves. But some of these Spaniards who came to the New World, they were impoverished aristocrats, some of them were vagrants, some of them professional soldiers, all kind of type of people, adventurous people, some of them were bandits, so all kind of people. So Hernando Cortez, actually, he was an educated guy, he was a lawyer by profession, but he also had this adventurous spirit within him. So he goes to the west, where the American Indians in Cuba pointed. Okay, and he goes and he stumbles upon, indeed, the powerful empire. There was the Aztec Empire. Aztec were people who controlled Mexico. So in 1519, he conquers this big Indian empire, Aztec Empire. Ironically, Cortez only had 300 people, Can you imagine? Only with 300 people, he conquered this huge indigenous empire that had 25 million people. So what happened? Very interesting for us to know, right? And that's where we see a few interesting things which sometimes are not mentioned in popular books today or in documentaries. Sometimes we think about American Indians like a homogeneous force. Okay, like on the one hand they were Europeans, on the other hand who were evil, on the other hand were Indians. All Indians were good, and that's what we have, these two forces, forces of goodness, forces of darkness, facing each other, fighting each other. It was not true, of course. Indians were regular people like everybody else. Again, unlike what sometimes you can see in romantic documentary movies where American Indians are depicted as stewards of nature, peaceful people who never fought each other. Of course, it's not true. Like Europeans, like Africans, like Asians, they were fighting each other, they traded with each other, they enslaved each other like everybody else. Okay. And the reason I mention this is to stress that the Aztec were actually imperialists. They had conquered Indians who lived in Mexico. The Aztec were a small group of people who invaded central Mexico in the 1200s. Aztec actually related to the present-day Shoshone Indians in the southwestern United States. Shoshone, Utah Indians. Okay, they belong to the same language family. It's called the Utah-Aztec language family. So, an Aztec, they lived in the 1100s in present-day Arizona, and eventually they moved for some climatic reasons, so I'm not going into details. So they moved to the southward and invaded central Mexico and brutally conquered local Indians. Okay, so local Indians started to pay them tribute, and they hated Aztec. Okay, on top of this, the Aztec, they created this very brutal ideology or religion. So they believed that each year they had to sacrifice thousands of people from conquered tribes to appease their gods. They believed that if they would not sacrifice thousands of people, young and beautiful people from conquered tribes, so the gods would be mad at them, and the circle of life would end. So in order to continue the circle of life, you had to practice this human sacrifice. So that is why Aztec priests, they ritually sacrificed thousands of people, cutting out their hearts and throwing the bodies of these people down the pyramid they had in their capital, Tenochtitlan. That was the capital of Aztec. So these bodies were thrown down to feed them to these gods, okay, who were to protect Aztec. Okay, so that's a very strange religion. Yeah, so they had to kill a lot of people. So very brutal people, and a lot of local Indians hated them. So as soon as Cortez landed on the Mexican coast, many Indians joined him. So a lot of Indians joined him. Again, their conquerors, Aztec. In fact, a woman whom he befriended, she right now is considered one of the Mexican early heroes, so to speak. Donna Marina. She was a Native American who was good, had linguistic skills. She was good in languages. She picked up quickly Spanish, and she became an interpreter for Cortez. Okay. So, accompanied by these Indians who hated Aztec, Cortez invaded Aztec Empire and conquered them. Another reason why he was able so quickly to defeat them was because Indians were demoralized. What happened? Look at the second part of this slide. I highlighted all the major reasons why Aztec were defeated. Okay. By the way, before I go to these major causes of the defeat of these Indians, I would want to bring to your attention the second empire in the New World, called the Inca Empire in the present-day Peru. You heard about this country, Peru. Okay, it's the middle part of South America. Inca Indians were like Aztec conquerors. They conquered local Indians, imposed themselves, and they created this a big empire where peasants had to work for the Inca Empire and his bureaucrats. That was this type of society. Okay, there were hardly any aristocrats. It was the society divided into peasants and bureaucrats who worked for the state, and on top of the pyramid was this Inca. It's like a king. So here we have the same story, actually the same story, rerun of the same story. Another conquistador named Francisco Pizarro in 1536 invaded the Inca Empire. Again, he was also driven by this goal to find gold, and indeed the Inca had gold. Okay, Francisco Pizarro conquered this empire because before he invaded this empire, it had been already demoralized by European diseases. Okay, because see, Europeans already were present in the New World for almost 40 years, and epidemic diseases which Indians were not familiar with, they quickly spread around, and many Indians, by the way, had died before Europeans reached these areas. Some Indians died before seeing any white man. Okay, it's because Indians in remote areas contracted European diseases from other Indians. Okay, and that's how Inca were demoralized. So it was easy for Francisco Pizarro to defeat this powerful empire. But even though Inca was a small empire, they had 3.5 million people instead of Aztec, that was then 25 million people. That was essentially the same story. Pizarro had only 600 conquistadors, and he crashed completely this Inca empire that had 3.5 million people. Anyway, diseases, epidemic diseases, the major killer of the Indians. So remember, the major killer of American Indians were not European guns. Okay, not European guns. Again, sometimes from popular books you have this false impression. I'm sure you have false impression that Europeans always tried to kill Indians. It's not true. It's not correct. 90% of Native Americans died from diseases. And what kind of diseases? Indians were not familiar with such European diseases like smallpox, plague, measles, flu. You name them. Okay. In old world, people who were exposed to these epidemic diseases, they developed immunity. You know, today we talk about so-called herd immunity, when people don't hide from the surrounding world, locking themselves in a basement, but they expose themselves a little bit moderately. Okay, trying to get immunity. In Sweden, for instance, that's how they in Sweden tried to deal with the coronavirus. Okay, of course people died, but they did develop immunity. And since we locked ourselves, I guess we still have a way to go before we develop immunity against this new virus. So Indians were in the same situation. They were not familiar with these European viruses, and they were killed. 90% of Indians died, unfortunately, from these European diseases. In fact, Indians were right now in the same situation which Europeans had found themselves in when? In the 1300s, when, as I said, 60% of Europeans had died from bubonic plague that had been brought by Mongols to Europe. Okay, but eventually Europeans did develop immunity for plague. But now, unfortunately, see, it was the Indians on this receiving end, so who had to deal with this, and a lot of them died. Okay. There was another reason why Indians could not resist Europeans. In addition, so I already named two reasons. First, we shouldn't treat Indians like unanimous force. They were fighting each other, and some Indians conquered the other Indians. So it was that is why, in case of Aztec and Inca, Spaniards simply replaced the elite, this Inca and Aztec elite, and started to command, to rule these Indians who had been conquered before by Aztec and Inca. So we have local Indians who received the new masters. That's how it was. That's it. Okay. Before it was Aztec and Inca. Now it became Spaniards. But there was another reason, a technological technology. So Indians were not as advanced as Europeans in technology. For example, Indians were not familiar with such common things which all people in old world knew, like the wheel. They didn't have any wheel carts, nothing. They hardly had any domestic animals except the dogs and llama. Llama, it's a camel-like animal that was domesticated by the Inca. In fact, in many other areas of the New World, Indians were not familiar with llama. Okay, so no, hardly any domesticated animals. But Europeans had cows. They had sheep. They had goats, rabbits, chickens, any kind of bird, domesticated birds and animals. Okay. Plus, Europeans had guns and cannons. Europeans had horses. By the way, American Indians were not familiar with horses, and when Aztec first saw the Europeans riding horses, they believed that some kind of strange beasts, okay, that the upper part of this beast was human-like, the centaurs. Remember, in the Greek mythology, we have these creatures called centauruses. So the bottom part like horse-like, and the upper part of these human beings are human-like. That's what Indians, that's how Indians saw them, you know, like strange creatures, scary creatures. And plus, when the Indians started to die from diseases left and right, many of them came to believe that Europeans had some powerful medicine, spiritual medicine power, deadly medicine power. Okay, that's, by the way, one of the reasons why in Latin America many Indians converted to Catholic Church, Catholic Christianity. Okay, because many of them came to believe that these conquerors, conquistadors, these white people had a very powerful medicine, and we would rather plug into this medicine. We will rather use this medicine instead of fighting this medicine. Okay, so let's use this medicine. See? So what do we make of this? What happened in as a result of this discovery, invasion, collision of two worlds. Okay, we have something which scholars call Columbian exchange. In fact, in your textbook you will see this expression, Columbian exchange. Okay, it's like two parts of the world met each other. In Columbian exchange, it means the exchange of good and bad things between two parts of the world. Okay, so Europeans brought certain items which American Indians were not familiar with, such as iron, wheels, science, plows. Indians didn't have plow, boats, and unfortunately epidemic diseases. See, but at the same time, Native Americans also gave something to Europe. Again, you shouldn't picture it like this, like two parts of the world meet each other and begin to exchange. No, it happened gradually as a result of trade, as a result of copying each other. Okay, and certain items, for instance, did not directly enter the life of Europeans or Indians. Okay, like wheels, for instance. In the interior parts of North America, American Indians actually did not use wheels until the end of the 19th century. Okay, if you read about so-called Plains Indians of American West, you know that they use certain poles with skins tied to them, and they drag them on the ground. They were labeled by a French expression, travois, travois, these poles with skins in between, where Indians piled their stuff and carried around. So they dragged it on the ground, that did not use wheels. Okay, didn't use plows. But in Europe, for instance, we have such new things introduced from the New World, from Americas, such as tobacco. Europeans were not familiar with tobacco. Beans, Europeans brought beans from the New World. Chocolate, Europeans were not familiar with chocolate. And one of the most important crops, potatoes, corn, or maize, corn. Europeans were not familiar with corn. And by the way, corn became so popular in Europe that it eventually was used as a fodder for animals. Okay, and to the present day, by the way, that's what they do in Europe and other parts of the world, all the world, with corn. Unlike Americans who have cornbread, cooked corn. So to the present day, in many parts of old world, primarily in Europe, they use corn to feed the pigs, and they consider it as something that should be used to feed the animals, domestic animals. Okay, and finally, another crucial crop, potatoes. Potatoes was introduced in Europe gradually, not right away, by the way. No, it was brought only in my home country, Russia. Potato was not introduced until the 1700s. In fact, Russian czars or kings had to force peasants to plant potatoes because the peasants didn't want to accept this evil fruit. They thought that they could be poisoned. Okay, and Russian czar actually had to send troops to force peasants to plant potatoes. And later, when potatoes were accepted as the staple crop, it saved parts of the old world from famine. For example, in Russia, where people had resisted against potatoes, eventually it became like a staple food for regular people, and it saved the Russian population during the Second World War because people survived on potatoes. Same in Ireland. Ireland, the major food for Irish people by the 19th century was potato. And I will give you right now a fact from Irish history that shows how potato became important for the Europeans. In the middle of the 1800s, there was a potato bug that infected the potato crops in Ireland. So a lot of potato crops died, and eventually this produced a huge famine in Ireland. About 3 million people died because they didn't have enough potatoes. See, that's just to show to you how much parts of Europe became dependent on this Indian, if you wish, Indian crop brought from the Native America. See, it's very important. And another funny story about tomatoes. In fact, even though tomatoes were native to North and South America, those Europeans who lived in North America, for instance, they still treated tomatoes cautiously. They didn't trust them. They thought it was poisonous. And in fact, until the beginning of the 18th century, Americans in the present United States, eastern part of North America, they did not cultivate tomatoes. There's a funny story when during the American Revolutionary War, the British, they wanted to kill somehow George Washington, the commander of the Revolutionary Army, and they sent their agent to the Washington camp, and this agent, he posed as a cook. he was able to wiggle himself into the Washington kitchen. He started cooking for him. And eventually he decided to use tomatoes. So he decided to cook him a dish made of tomatoes, because the assumption was that tomatoes were so poisonous. So the goal was to poison George Washington. And in fact, this guy, spy, left for us a letter. So he wrote a letter to his British troops, British commander, in which he said, so tomorrow this evil American general was going to die, and I will die too. Okay, so he had this suicide note because he believed he did his job. He poisoned George Washington, and that would be the end of story. Of course, little did he know that George Washington didn't die. He ate this well-cooked dinner and happily commanded the revolutionary troops. Now, what kind of system did the Spaniards and the Portuguese introduce in Native America after they conquered? Okay, a few words about it. The system which they introduced in Native America became known as encomienda. Encomienda, basically, it's a system which reminded them system that had existed in Europe before modern times. Basically feudalism. As I told you, in pre-modern times in Europe, people lived in society that was divided in three groups of population: lords, peasant serfs, and clergy, priests, monks. And that was it. Three major classes of people. And as I said, after the epidemic of plague in the 1300s, gradually the society was changed, and the peasants were not so humble. They escaped from their landlords. Why? Because of the disease, and the peasant labor became costly. And by early modern times in Western Europe, peasants were not serfs anymore. Okay, I have to explain to you what a serf means. Serf means a peasant who personally was free, but at the same time he was or she was bound to land, and they were not allowed to leave the land. They were obligated to work for their landlords. Okay, so that's the major difference between serfs and slaves. Serfs were almost like slaves. Okay, not completely slaves, but almost like slaves. They were bound to land, although lords could not sell them without land. See, they could do it with slaves, but not with peasants. Peasants could be sold, but only with land. So there were cases when landlords sometimes sold their peasants along with land. Okay. And this type of society in Europe in early Middle Ages, it was gone. It was gone. And these aristocrats, they actually wanted to recreate this type of society. They kind of had nostalgia. Oh, our forefathers, grandfathers were lords. They had peasants, and peasants worked for them, and everything was good. Okay, or at least that's how some conquistadors thought. So they wanted basically to turn Indians, American Indians, into serfs, to turn them into peasants, to make them work for themselves, to bound them to land, or to bound them to gold and silver mines, and to force them to work. And in fact, the Spanish and the Portuguese kings granted lands to these conquistadors. So conquistadors received land grants from the king of Portugal, king of Spain. By the way, I forgot to mention that Portuguese also followed the Spaniards. Remember, originally Spaniards had been envious of the Portuguese because Portuguese had discovered the sea routes to the Orient, okay, trade for spices, and they go to the Americas and conquer the Latin America, establish Spanish colonies. And now Portuguese became envious. They said, oh, we want too the piece of pie, American pie. And they go, but there was hardly anything left. So only Brazil was open, still not colonized by the Spaniards. And that's what the Portuguese came to occupy. So they occupied Brazil. And that's how eventually Latin America became divided into Portuguese part, Brazil, and the Spanish part, which was Venezuela, Bolivia, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Argentina, Mexico, and a bunch of small countries, the Spanish colonies. Okay, but let's go back to encomienda. Encomienda, basically, it's a feudalism. It's serf labor, which was exploited by the Spanish conquerors. Okay, each conquistador thought about himself as a landlord, and he expected local Indians to work for him, and they did on these land grants given to these conquistadors. These big land grants given to conquistadors became known as latifundia. Latifundia, that's the word we use to describe these big land estates, okay, received by conquistadors. But there was one problem. There was one and big problem with this system. Okay, they thought they would be lords and a bunch of Indians would be working on the land, like peasants providing for them, but it didn't happen. Why? That is why. You see it here. Okay, you see it right here. 90% of Indians died out because of smallpox, measles, flu, tuberculosis, and all kind of European diseases. So we have these new aristocrats, conquistadors, who thought about themselves as new landlords, and now they didn't have any labor to work for them. It's a very important slide, okay, because I would like to alert you about something. Next time we're going to talk about transatlantic slave trade. Now you need to see the connection between this, what I'm showing to you right now, see, and the new topic we're going to discuss next time, called transatlantic slave trade. Okay, but my story is not over. I just want to alert you that my next lecture next week will start with this particular slide, because I will want to make a connection between our conversation today and our next conversation. Now, what happened with Spain as a result of this invasion of Latin America? Spain became the richest empire in the world. It created the biggest empire in the world, a very wealthy, powerful, and spoiled with riches. There was influx of so-called bullion. Again, it has nothing to do with soup or broth. Bullion, it's like an economic expression to describe the chunks of gold and silver. Okay, when we talk about chunks of gold and silver, we use this expression bullion. Okay, so influx of chunks of gold and silver to Europe, to Spain, at first to Spain and then to other parts of Europe. How? Spaniards became spoiled with riches. Okay, they actually did not develop any manufacturing. Why? They didn't need, because they had plenty of money. They could buy everything. At first, Spaniards, they were manufacturing boats, they were manufacturing guns and cannons, but they stopped doing this. They started to buy it from other countries, okay, because they had money. So Spain paid foreign suppliers and did not invest in developing manufacturing inside the country. Big mistake. So they became dependent on other countries to provide them with goodies. Sounds familiar, right? There's some country currently that also became very dependent on another country for all kind of small junks, big and small junk. Okay, so much dependent that even medicine has been manufactured in this country. But it's sidetracking. I don't want to sidetrack. Anyway, Spain ceased to be an enterprising country. So before, people who lived in Spain, they were enterprise and adventurous people, but now they became spoiled with riches. Imagine a person who won a lottery. You know the fate of people who win the lottery. 95% of them, they end up in poverty with no money. Why? Because they don't know how to handle this money. That's what statistics says. A lot of these people who won the lottery, they became spoiled with riches and they wasted their money. It didn't do them any good, okay, because they didn't work for it. Same story is here, okay, with the Spanish Empire. Very big, very rich, and the country that ceased to be an enterprising country. Okay. Spain practiced so-called mercantilism. Mercantilism, it's like hoarding the wealth, like accumulating wealth. They didn't know how to invest it. They wanted to accumulate the wealth, like people say, to store the mattress, to store your golden mattress. Of course, I use mattress as a metaphor. Basically trying to store gold, and they use the gold to buy something, whatever they needed. Okay. So since conquistadors were very successful people, they became rich, they conquered Indians, they exploited Indian labor, they got gold, everything, silver. So in the eyes of Spaniards, regular people, peasants, like rich and poor, in the eyes of these people, the role model, the person whose behavior was the role model, was the warrior knight, conquistador. That was the role model. This adventurous man that goes overseas and conquers the Indians and exploits them. See, the role models are very important. So each culture and society, they create for themselves particular role models. And whatever role models you have in society sometimes defines how successful or unsuccessful these cultures and countries would be. So role models are very important. Who you would like to imitate, okay? Who would you like to imitate? If you want to imitate the bad guy, I doubt that your economy, your society, your culture will be prosperous. If you want to imitate a good guy, you might prosper. Of course, the borderline between good and bad guys sometimes are very vague, but role models are very important. Let's put it this way. Okay. Unfortunately, other Europeans took advantage of the Spanish wealth. Okay, who were these other people? Those European nations, countries, which did not have access to, at least did not have so much access to the colonies. Okay, because see, Spaniards and Portuguese, they colonized the New World, and the Portuguese controlled the Indian Ocean trade. There were hardly any room for instance, for such countries as Netherlands, or as they were called, the Dutch at that time. And the name for Netherlands was Holland. See, if you see these names, Netherlands, Holland, and Dutch, we're talking about the same people. Okay, don't be confused. Same people, same country. Okay, the old name for Netherlands, Holland, people who live in Holland are called the Dutch. Okay, so the Dutch did not have such a wide access to colonies, so they had to fight, either to fight for the colonies, or originally, when they didn't have enough a military force, they had to trade, they had to wiggle themselves somehow in this colonial enterprise. How? They started to build boats for Spaniards, they started to build guns, cannons, utensils, whatever, the small and big stuff, and selling this stuff to Spaniards and Portuguese. Okay, the Dutch were also famous sea-going people. Okay, they were famous fishermen who since early Middle Ages lived by the sea. Sometimes there's an expression that the power of the Dutch was raised on the back of the herring. It's a fish in the northern part of Atlantic, so it was like a fish country. Okay, and now they rerouted their fleet to serve the Spaniards. In fact, they provided the boats to carry Spanish goodies from the New World to Old World, and from Old World to New World. simply because it was easy for Spaniards to contract these Dutch boats to carry things. And eventually, these middlemen, these manufacturers, these enterprising people called Dutch, they were taking over. Okay, gradually, slowly but surely, because they were more enterprising people than Spaniards. See, Spaniards, they conquistadors. We don't want to work, we want to fight. Okay, even to be a merchant in the eyes of Spaniards was not a good thing at that time. Okay, the merchant was not a role model. But in Netherlands, Holland, the Dutch people, they had another role model. It was the merchant. Again, when I talk the merchant, it's a generalized character of a merchant. So the merchants were role models. Okay, another country was in Europe called England, open to the seas, but which also didn't have access to colonies, and they wanted to get part of this colonial enterprise. Okay, so they also started to serve Spaniards and Portuguese. Okay, providing credit. Eventually, the gold was over. Gold was extracted from gold mines, and silver mines were also depleted. Gold mines and silver mines were eventually depleted by the 1600s in Latin America. And a lot of these descendants of conquistadors, they ended up being in debt. And they owed money to the Dutch and English merchants. Okay, so eventually English and Dutch merchants, they took over chunks of land in Latin America. See, that's how in parts of Latin America, Spanish colonies ended up, or Spanish plantations, Portuguese plantations ended up in the hands of English owners. Okay. And I repeat, there was a big difference between Portugal and Spain on the one hand, and England and Netherlands on the other hand. The first two countries were losing the spirit of enterprise, and a second group of countries, England and Portugal, England and Netherlands, the Dutch, they did develop the spirit of enterprise. Okay, in Portugal and Spain, the role model was the conquistador, this lord warrior. In England and Netherlands, the role model was the merchant, a person, enterprising person who knew how to make money. In fact, Spaniards despised the English because of this, and the Dutch received this nickname, the nations of shopkeepers. The nations of shopkeepers. See the difference? Okay. In fact, Holland was a merchant republic. Okay. People were citizens, people who paid taxes. People who paid taxes, they controlled the country, they had the right to vote. Those people who did not pay taxes, so who did not contribute to the basket, national basket, they didn't have a right to vote. Interesting system, right? There was a lot of religious toleration in Netherlands and England. Why? Because they said in the Church of Commerce, all religions and nationalities are equal. See, because they were commerce oriented. So that is why they did not persecute people who belonged to other religions. A lot of Jews moved to Netherlands and England, escaping from Spain and Portugal or France. Okay. What Holland and England had was known as capitalism. It's economy that belonged to private entrepreneurs who knew how to use money, how to invest money, how to do banking, how to market goods. See, these things were not familiar to Spaniards and Portuguese. They didn't have any banks in Portugal and Spain. It was the Dutch and the English who were the first to introduce these things. Okay. So eventually the spirit of enterprise led to a very simple situation. The money that had been extracted by the Spaniards from the New World ended up in the pockets of the Dutch and English merchants. Okay. And by the way, I forgot to mention, there was only one area in the New World that remained uncolonized by the Spaniards. It was North America. And that's where the Dutch and the English go, as you know. So North America, New England, eastern part of present-day United States, that's the area that was colonized by the English, and also small parts of North America were colonized by the Dutch, and then French come later to colonize Canada. But Spaniards were not interested in North America. Why? Too cold, and there was no gold at that time. Of course, nobody heard about California at that time. When later, in the middle of the 19th century, gold was discovered. At that time, there was no gold. They didn't know that there was gold. But anyway, there was no gold in eastern part of North America. Okay, so Spaniards were not interested. They did colonize Florida, as you know, and built their St. Augustine, town of St. Augustine in Florida, that the major town, Spanish town in North America. That's it. So the rest of North America was populated by Native Americans, hunting and hunters and gatherers, and that's where England and the Dutch went, and a few other European countries which didn't have any place to go to colonize, like Sweden. Okay, you know that parts of New York, present-day New York State, were colonized by Swedish people. Okay, and since there was no gold in North America, the English and the Dutch, they came there to what? To trade with Indians. So they didn't make war at first on Indians. First, they were interested in trade, unlike Spain that wanted to conquer Indians and turn them into serfs. So they traded with Indians for what? Pelts. Pelts was the major attraction. That's what attracted Europeans in North America. Okay. So Native Americans purchased guns, iron utensils from Europeans, and in exchange they gave beaver pelts, deer skins, and all this stuff. Okay, but eventually Europeans discovered that there were fertile lands there. Okay, and they also wanted these lands, and that's when the wars started between Native Americans and Europeans. But the same, like in southern part of the Western Hemisphere, North America Indians also were fighting each other, and frequently Europeans and Indian tribes concluded alliances with each other against other Indians and Europeans. So it was just like a hectic world where people were trading, fighting each other. Okay, but originally there was a big interest in trade. By the way, Dutch still continued to trade with Indians. There were no agricultural colonies of the Dutch in North America. It was mostly trade for pelts. Okay, so essentially we have two ways to colonize Western Hemisphere. In southern part, Latin America, it's Mexican South America, it's called Latin America. We have Spain coming in and trying to conquer Indians and exploit Indian labor, peasant labor, or labor at mines, silver and gold mines. Or on the other hand, we have trade colonization by the Dutch, by the English, by the Swedish to trade with Indians, and eventually land colonization in parts of North America. Another interesting thing, in South America, where male colonizers came, conquistadors, to conquer Indians, they of course picked up concubines among Indians, and quickly we have a large segment of population in Latin America called mestizos, or mixed blood people, so half Spanish, half Indian. Okay, mestizos. But in North America, we don't have too much of this stuff, because those Europeans who came to eventually colonize part of North America, many of them came by families, so men and women. So and eventually when Europeans, not everywhere, I repeat, in parts of North America where Europeans discovered that, oh, it's a good fertile land, they started to colonize these lands, and on many occasions they did not intermarry with Indians because they came by families, especially so-called Puritans. But again, to be fair, in many parts of North America, we still have trade colonization where Indians were not subjugated, were not occupied. So Europeans still continued to trade, and Canada is the best example in this case. So here you can see the map of Canada in the 1600s, 1700s, and the huge and a greater part of 1800s. Canada was the domain of so-called Hudson Bay Company. It's a trading company. English king gave a right to this company to build trade posts all over Canada to trade with the Indians. Okay, so here Europeans were not interested in killing Indians. There were hardly any Indian wars, which we have a lot of Indian wars. You know, we have eventually in the United States, what became known as United States, because there was a lot of fertile land. But in Canada, there were hardly any Indian wars. Okay, especially in the northern part of Canada, okay, with taiga forest, because here Europeans were interested. In fact, they were interested in having a lot of Indians and Indians being well and alive. Okay, you don't kill your customers. So Hudson Bay Company, in fact, encouraged Indian prosperity. But these Indians who traded with the British from Hudson Bay Company, they became dependent on Hudson Bay Company. They got in debt, okay, because on many occasions Hudson Bay Company issued credit to the Indians, so Indians got in debt, and eventually debt was transferred in families. So even though Hudson Bay Company was not making any wars on the Indians, because Indians were their customers, right? Still, almost all Indians ended up being in debt. Okay, so they became dependent on the Hudson Bay Company. Okay. England and Spain eventually, they had to compete with each other. They had, because these were two ways of life. Okay, on the one hand, we have Spain, conquistadors, warriors who didn't care about spirit of enterprise, didn't care about commerce. And on the other hand, we have England, a prosperous, enterprising country, nation of shopkeepers that held commerce in the high esteem. Okay, and Spain hated this fact that England was becoming so powerful that it was about to overshadow this Spanish Empire. So at some point, this animosity between two countries became so strong that they had to fight each other. Plus, I didn't mention this, there was a lot of bad blood between these two countries because of religion. England was a Protestant country, as I said, jumping ahead. In a week we are going to talk about Reformation, why in Europe and how in Europe Christians became divided into Catholics and Protestants. But at this point I want to mention that England was a Protestant country. Spain was a Catholic, die-hard Catholic country. So they hated each other for religious reasons. So on top of this political, economic reasons, the jealousy of Spain that England was so prosperous, so successful, and hatred that these merchants were so involved with this money, and it's not good. We are conquistadors. On top of this, there was a religious conflict. So 1588, there was the biggest showdown. Netherlands, which at first was attacked by Spain, received help from England because they were enterprising countries, they were merchant nations, and plus they belonged to the same religion. They were Protestant nations. So England and the Netherlands acted together. Spain wanted to invade Netherlands, to subjugate Netherlands, okay? And Spain eventually, while fighting against Netherlands, they sent a big fleet against England. The year was 1588. This big fleet, almost 300 boats, was called Spanish Armada. Armada is something big. That's what it means. But English Queen Elizabeth at that time, she was the queen in England who encouraged merchants. She encouraged manufacture and trade, okay, very much. So she mobilized all her merchants. She mobilized English pirates, okay, to fight against Spanish fleet. Unfortunately, there was an unfavorable wind that spread around Spanish boats which approached the English coast, and the English pirates and English merchants and the Dutch together attacked these boats and destroyed this fleet, which partially was already destroyed by Mother Nature because, as I said, the unfavorable wind spread around and smashed some of the boats, and those boats that hadn't been smashed were finished by the English and the Dutch. So the Spanish Armada disaster, the fleet was destroyed, and that was the beginning of the end of the Spanish Empire. So we have the new power on the rise called England and her small friend Netherlands. Of course, later when they defeated Spain, England and Netherlands also started to compete with each other, but it's another story. Okay, I will see you next time, and thank you for your attention.